Alright, this is going to be a video where I explain some complications that you can get while using the VR method. Some caveats, basically. Yeah, let's start with the first one. The first one is what happens if your skeleton contains a DR breaking portion. So, for example, let's say we have R2, U, R, L, U2, R prime, L prime, U, B2, U2, F2, U. I don't know, something like this. How do you deal with this? Well, what you can do, so one thing that always works is that you can take a solid cube, do the sequence in the middle, or I guess technically that would be you had to do the inverse of the sequence in the middle. So for example, here I'll do RL, U2, R2. I guess this is a bad example. Let me actually do a better example. Let's say this is like this. So I would invert this. So I take a solid cube and do L prime R, U2, L prime R prime. And you notice that this is the same on the slice. This is the same thing as L2 F2. Let's use a screen pen. This is the same thing as L2 F2, except you're not allowed to kind of insert anything in the middle. So if you do our usual RF thingy, RF, RF, R, and then this becomes okay plus minus minus, but this minus minus is actually unbreakable. You cannot insert anything in here. So you actually, what you can do is sum them immediately. So you do not consider this as a minus minus, but as a plus. Okay. So even if you're looking for VRC plus 2, you cannot separate these two because this L2 F2 is like it doesn't correspond to anything here. This is just replacement. Okay. And this is plus and this is minus. Okay. And yeah, this actually turns out to be like quite a doomed skeleton if you get like minus. But yeah. Okay, not quite. No, there's a VRC plus 1. The next caveat is what happens if you have UD2 in your skeleton. This can happen because I had this happen a few times. So let's say you get to DR, you're doing some moves on normal, in particular it ends with a quarter turn, and let's say the quarter turn is a U. Then you switch to the inverse and you find a finish directly on the inverse, entirely on the inverse. But the last move that you do is a D2. So if you then write the skeleton, undoing this, you get a UD2 in your skeleton, which technically we do not want, but actually you can do it with this without having to rewrite the skeleton. And here's how. Let's say we have R2, U, F2, U, and then D2, and then you have B2, L2, U2, R2, U, F2, U prime. Basically, let's say we have this as a VR. Okay. What we're going to do is, okay, we're going to do a usual thing, R2, U wide, F2. But now here, instead of leaving it as is, we widen the D2. So we get U D Y2, which is the same thing as U prime Y2. So we just preemptively insert an E2 because this doesn't affect VR. Okay? And we might have to undo this if the step 2 requires that we do that. But yeah. Now instead, suppose that the VR that we're looking for is instead this one. Okay. Then you would do R2, U wide, F2. And then basically you need to replace this U D2 with a U wide D2, which is the same thing as U wide prime Y2. And then you keep going. So basically, if you have a single UD2 in your skeleton, you can, instead of like keeping it that way, if you normally wouldn't widen it, you just widen the D2. You just insert an E2 basically. You either insert, in this case, either an E prime or an E2, depending on depending on the VR, basically. The next caveat is about blocky fish. So this is actually quite an important tip in general, even for like non-slice specific stuff. But if you have anywhere in your skeleton this sequence here, then you can replace it with U2, F2, sorry, U prime, F2, U2, R2, U prime. And this only affects the slice. This is called a blocky fish replacement. And This is only one example. You can have the U moves at the end being opposite direction, or even on opposite side. You can have one of these U being a D move. This U2 can be a D2 as well. And obviously the R2 and F2 can be any two adjacent side turns, which tend to be double moves on the sides. Yeah. So this affects the slice, and you would think that now you actually have to do two leaf slices. That's not quite the case, actually, because if you do let's do our usual R2 RF stuff. Here we get plus plus, and here we get minus minus. And okay, I guess if you didn't watch the video Math of VR, you don't quite understand why this is, but switching the signs is the same thing as picking a segment. So basically, the upshot is that if you find a VR on the skeleton that contains this version of the blocky fish, this is the same thing as finding a VR on this version, but if you had picked this as part of your segments, then you do not pick this, and if you had not picked this, then you do pick this. Let's do an example because it's kind of hard to understand. Let's say to something like this, and let's say this is a VR. Now we get two VRs out of this because we can either not do the blocky fish replacement and do a normal thing, or we can do the blocky fish replacement, but then this is the same thing as I don't know how to write this. Basically, it would be the same as picking this, but with the blocky fish replacement. So it's be U wide R2, and then U prime F2 U2 R2 U wide prime F2. And let's actually do another example where instead we do pick the blocky fish segment. It doesn't have to be bound here, it just needs to be part of the segments. So this would be normally U wide R2 U R2 U2 F2 U wide F2 U, or I can do U wide R2, and then here I don't pick this segment anymore, but do the blocky fish replacement. Okay. Now there's a last caveat, and this is regarding specifically to VRs in +2 or more, which basically need VRs in +2 only, because I don't think you ever need to look for VRs in +3. But yeah. So you know how R2 and L2 commute, right? Now generally, when doing VR, you're not inserting something between R2 and L2 because that adds 2 moves, and if you're not looking for VR in +2 or more, then you don't even look for these. But if you are looking for VR in +2, you need to be careful that stuff like this is different. Now you don't need to consider the skeletons as different. So let's do an example. Let's say you have U, R2, L2, F2, U prime, F2, U. And we're looking for VR in +2. Okay. And let's say we find this VR. Then actually we have two VRs, because we can have U wide R2, and then let's say U wide U prime L2 to U prime F2 U. But we can also switch the R2 and the L2. And the thing about switching the R2 and the L2 is that it doesn't affect the signs, okay? Because in this case, this is plus and minus, but if we switch, it's still plus and minus because we didn't change the axis. Yeah. So we get this VR for free. Again, this is something that only concerns you if you're looking for VR in +2 or more, just because of where you sit in this. So it's kind of rare that you need to think about that, but yeah, be careful. I think that's all. So see you in the next video.